In 1964, Chrysler was dying, not slowly, not gracefully, dying. The muscle car wars were raging across America, and Chrysler was getting absolutely destroyed. Ford had the Mustang, General Motors had the GTO, and Chrysler had excuses. Their racing program was a joke. Their street performance was mediocre at best. And the American public, and especially the young, speed-obsessed American public, was buying Fords and Chevys by the thousands while Chrysler dealerships gathered dust. This is the story of the 426 Hemi and how one engine, a single, revolutionary, borderline insane piece of engineering, saved an entire company from extinction. Along the way, we're going to see corporate desperation, engineering brilliance, a racing ban that backfired spectacularly, and one of the most dominant power plants ever bolted into an American automobile. So let's begin. But first, how did Chrysler end up in such a desperate position to begin with? Now, to understand why the Hemi mattered so much, you need to understand where Chrysler stood in the early 1960s, and honestly, it wasn't pretty. See, the American auto industry in that era was basically a three-way war. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, the big three, were locked in constant combat for market share, brand loyalty, and bragging rights. And by 1963, Chrysler was losing on all fronts. They had a reputation problem. Their cars were seen as your father's cars. Reliable, sure. Practical, absolutely. But exciting, fast, cool, not even close. The thing is, this mattered more than you might think. The early 60s saw a fundamental shift in what Americans wanted from their automobiles. The post-war generation was coming of age, and they didn't want their parents' sedans. They wanted speed. They wanted power. They wanted something that would turn heads at the drive-in and leave Chevys in the dust at the stoplight. Ford figured this out first. The Mustang, launched in 1964, was an absolute phenomenon. General Motors had the Pontiac GTO, which basically invented the muscle car concept. Take a mid-size car, stuff the biggest engine you can find into it, and watch the sales numbers explode. These weren't just cars. They were statements. They were rebellion, wrapped in chrome and horsepower. And Chrysler? Chrysler was still building sensible family transportation while the competition was setting the world on fire. The executives in Highland Park, Michigan, Chrysler's headquarters, knew they had a problem. A big one. Market share was slipping. The youth demographic was completely lost to them. And in the automotive industry, losing the young buyers meant losing the future. Those 20-somethings buying Mustangs today would be buying Ford sedans and station wagons for the next 40 years. Brand loyalty started early, and Chrysler was missing the boat entirely. But here's where it gets interesting, because Chrysler had something that Ford and GM didn't. They had a secret weapon buried in their engineering department. They had the hemispherical combustion chamber. I mention this because the technology itself wasn't new. Chrysler had actually built Hemi engines back in the early 1950s, the legendary firepower V8s that dominated NASCAR and set land speed records. But by 1958, Chrysler had abandoned the design. Too expensive to manufacture, too complex for the average consumer who just wanted reliable transportation. The accountants won, as accountants often do, and the Hemi was shelved. For 6 years, it sat there, forgotten. A relic of a different era when Chrysler actually knew how to build exciting cars. But in 1962, with the company hemorrhaging market share and the muscle car revolution leaving them behind, a group of engineers started asking a dangerous question. What if we brought it back? The man leading this charge was a guy named Tom Hoover. Now, Hoover wasn't some corporate suit making decisions in a boardroom. He was an engineer, a real, honest-to-God gearhead who understood engines the way some people understand poetry. And Hoover had been thinking about hemispherical combustion chambers for years. The basic concept is actually pretty elegant. In a conventional engine, the combustion chamber, The space where fuel and air mix and explode to create power is typically wedge-shaped or flat. It works fine. Millions of cars run on this design, but it's not optimal. A hemispherical chamber, shaped like half a sphere, allows for larger valves positioned at better angles. This means better airflow into and out of the cylinder. Better airflow means more efficient combustion. More efficient combustion means more power. It's that simple. Well, okay, it's not simple at all. The engineering is incredibly complex, but the principle is straightforward. The problem was cost. A Hemi engine required 2 rocker shafts per cylinder head instead of 1. It needed specially designed intake and exhaust manifolds. The machining tolerances were tighter. Everything about it was more expensive, more complicated, and harder to mass produce. But Hoover had an argument that the accountants couldn't ignore. Chrysler was dying anyway. What did they have to lose? In early 1963, Chrysler greenlit the project. The goal was simple and audacious: build the most powerful engine in American racing and use it to completely humiliate the competition. If Chrysler couldn't win the showroom war, maybe they could win the racetrack war and let the victories sell the cars. The development timeline was insane. Hoover's team had less than a year to design, build, and test a race-ready engine. For context, most engine programs take 3 to 5 years. Chrysler was trying to do it in months. They started with a clean sheet. The 426 cubic inch displacement was chosen because NASCAR rules at the time allowed engines up to 430 cubic inches. Go right to the edge of legal, but leave yourself a small margin for error. Smart. The hemispherical heads were the heart of the design. Each cylinder got 2 valves, 1 intake, 1 exhaust, positioned at a 58.5-degree included angle. This might sound like a minor technical detail, but that angle was the result of countless hours of testing and calculation. Too steep, and you lose airflow efficiency. Too shallow, and the valves can't be large enough. 58.5 degrees was the sweet spot. The intake valves were massive, 2.25 inches in diameter. The exhausts were 1.94 inches. For comparison, most production engines of the era used valves half that size. More valve area meant more air. More air meant more power. It was brute force engineering, but it worked. By late 1963, the first prototype engines were running on the dyno. The numbers were staggering. In race trim, the 426 Hemi was producing over 550 horsepower. That's more than double what most production V8s made at the time. More than anything Ford had. More than anything GM had. But dyno numbers don't win races. Racetracks do. And that's where Chrysler made their move. February 23, 1964, Daytona International Speedway. The Daytona 500, the biggest, most prestigious stock car race in America. Chrysler showed up with their new weapon, and what happened next shocked everyone. Richard Petty, driving a Plymouth Belvedere powered by the 426 Hemi, absolutely dominated. It wasn't even close. He led 184 of 200 laps. He finished a full lap ahead of second place. And behind him, more Chryslers. The Hemi-powered cars swept the top 3 positions. Think about that for a second. Chrysler went from joke to juggernaut in a single race. 1 year earlier, they were an afterthought in NASCAR. Now, they were untouchable. The automotive press went crazy. Newspapers ran headlines about Chrysler's miracle engine. Sports Illustrated covered it. Even people who didn't care about racing were suddenly talking about Plymouth and Dodge. But NASCAR wasn't happy, not happy at all. See, the 426 Hemi was technically illegal. NASCAR rules required that engines be available in production vehicles that regular customers could buy. The Hemi existed only in race cars. There was no street version. Chrysler had essentially shown up with a purpose-built race engine and claimed it was a production motor. NASCAR's response was swift and brutal. After the 1964 season, they banned the 426 Hemi. Gone. No more racing until Chrysler made a real production version available to the public. This should have been a disaster. Chrysler had just invested millions in an engine program that was now completely useless. Their racing success, the whole point of the exercise, was over before it really began. But here's the thing, the ban backfired. Spectacularly. Because NASCAR's decision did something the accountants at Chrysler never would have approved on their own. It forced Chrysler to build a street version of the Hemi, a real, honest-to-God production engine that anyone with enough cash could buy. And that changed everything. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week, all right? Here's what happened next. Because the Street Hemi, the engine that would become one of the most legendary power plants in automotive history, was about to be born. The engineers faced a serious challenge. The race Hemi was a fragile, high-strung beast that required constant maintenance and careful tuning. You couldn't sell that to regular customers. A street engine needed to be reliable, durable, and capable of running on pumped gas while sitting in traffic. Tom Hoover's team went back to work. They detuned the engine, lower compression ratio, milder camshaft, more conservative timing. They added a hydraulic valve train that didn't require constant adjustment. They engineered it to run on regular gasoline instead of racing fuel. The result was still absolutely monstrous. The 1966 Street Hemi produced 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque. Those were the official numbers anyway. Most experts believe Chrysler deliberately underrated the engine to avoid scaring insurance companies and attracting too much attention from safety regulators. The real output was probably closer to 500 horsepower. To put that in perspective, a 1966 Corvette, Chevrolet's flagship sports car, made 425 horsepower in its most powerful configuration, and that was considered extraordinary. Chrysler was putting the same power into mid-size sedans and coupes that cost thousands less. The Street Hemi debuted in 1966, and it was available across almost the entire Chrysler performance lineup: Plymouth Belvedere, Dodge Coronet, the newly launched Dodge Charger. If you wanted the most powerful engine in American automotive, you went to a Chrysler dealer. But power wasn't cheap. The Hemi option added roughly $1,000 to the price of any car. That's about $9,500 in today's money. It was a serious investment, and Chrysler didn't make it easy. They knew that most Hemi buyers were going to race these cars, so they required the heavy-duty suspension, the upgraded brakes, the strengthened transmission. You couldn't option a Hemi into a base model car. You got the whole package or nothing. This was deliberate. Chrysler wanted Hemi cars to be capable of handling the power. They wanted them to win. Every Saturday night at drag strips across America, every Sunday at NASCAR tracks, every traffic light encounter with Ford and Chevy owners, every single one of those was a marketing opportunity. And it worked. My God, did it work. On the drag strip, Hemi-powered cars were essentially untouchable in their classes. The lightweight Plymouth Barracuda and Dodge Dart models, stuffed with Hemi power, ran quarter-mile times that factory cars wouldn't match for decades. Privateer racers bought street Hemis, made minor modifications, and dominated local competition so thoroughly that some tracks started banning them. NASCAR eventually relented and allowed the Hemi back in 1966, with the production requirement satisfied. Richard Petty returned to dominance. David Pearson won championships. The Hemi became synonymous with winning. But the real magic happened on the street. Word spread quickly among the car-obsessed youth of America. If you wanted the fastest thing on four wheels, you bought a Hemi. It didn't matter that it was expensive. It didn't matter that insurance companies were starting to get nervous about muscle cars. It didn't matter that the ride was harsh and the fuel economy was atrocious. None of that mattered. What mattered was that when you pulled up to a stoplight next to a Mustang or a GTO, you knew, absolutely knew, that you had more power under your right foot than they did. That certainty was worth every penny of the premium. The Hemi transformed Chrysler's image almost overnight. The company that had been seen as building old people's cars was suddenly the performance leader. Plymouth and Dodge became the brands of choice for serious speed freaks. Chrysler dealerships, which had been struggling to move inventory, started seeing young buyers walk through the door specifically asking about Hemi cars. This was exactly what Chrysler needed, not just sales, though the sales helped, but relevance, cultural relevance. The Hemi put Chrysler back in the conversation, magazine covers, racing coverage, word of mouth. The intangible but absolutely crucial sense that Chrysler was cool again. And then came 1968. The Dodge Charger RT and Plymouth Roadrunner, both available with the 426 Hemi, became two of the most iconic muscle cars ever built. The Charger, with its fastback styling and hidden headlights, looked like nothing else on the road. The Roadrunner, stripped down and affordable, was designed explicitly for maximum performance per dollar. Chrysler had learned something important. The Hemi wasn't just an engine, it was a halo. Even customers who couldn't afford the Hemi option, and most couldn't, wanted to buy the cars that could have it. The Hemi made every Chrysler performance car more desirable simply by existing. Sales of Plymouth and Dodge performance models soared. In 1968, Plymouth sold over 45,000 Roadrunners. The following year, that number nearly doubled. These weren't all Hemi cars. Most had the cheaper but still potent 383 or 440 engines, but the Hemi's reputation sold them anyway. The halo effect extended beyond the showroom. Young buyers who couldn't afford a Hemi in 1968 remembered it. They talked about it. They aspired to it. And when they got older and had more money, many of them came back to Chrysler. The brand loyalty that Chrysler had been hemorrhaging was suddenly being rebuilt, one Hemi legend at a time. By 1969, Chrysler had pulled off something remarkable. They had gone from desperate also-ran to serious competitor in the muscle car wars. Market share stabilized, the company was profitable again, and the 426 Hemi was the reason why. But the story doesn't end there, because the muscle car era itself was about to end. The early 1970s brought a perfect storm of disasters for American performance cars. Rising insurance rates made muscle cars increasingly expensive for young buyers. New emissions regulations strangled engine output. The 1973 oil crisis made gas-guzzling V8s suddenly seem irresponsible. Safety advocates lobbied against high-performance vehicles. One by one, the great muscle car engines started to disappear. The Chevrolet 454 was neutered. The Ford 429 was discontinued. Pontiac's legendary 455 became a shadow of its former self. And in 1971, Chrysler killed the Hemi. The last 426 Hemis rolled off the production line in spring of that year. After just 6 years of production, the engine that had saved Chrysler was gone. Total production across all years? Approximately 11,000 units. That's it. 11,000 engines across multiple vehicle platforms over 6 years. This scarcity would become part of the legend. A genuine Hemi car was rare even when new. As the years passed and muscle cars became collectible, Hemi vehicles became the holy grail. Surviving examples commanded premium prices that only increased with time. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because the real question is, did the Hemi actually save Chrysler? The answer is complicated, but ultimately, yes. Here's the thing about the automobile business. It's not just about selling cars, it's about selling an idea of what your brand represents. In the early 1960s, Chrysler's idea was boring, safe, forgettable. That's a death sentence in an industry built on aspiration and desire. The Hemi changed the idea. Suddenly, Chrysler represented power, victory, excitement. Even if you never bought a Hemi car, you knew what Chrysler was capable of building. That knowledge changed how you thought about every single vehicle in their lineup. The revenue from Hemi car sales, while significant, was almost beside the point. The real value was in the reputation, the racing victories, the magazine covers, the stories told at gas stations and parking lots across America about that insane Hemi that destroyed everything at the Strip last weekend. Chrysler's market share bottomed out in 1962 and began recovering in 1965, directly coinciding with the Hemi program. By 1968, they had rebuilt their position enough to remain a viable competitor. Without the Hemi, without the racing success, without the cultural cachet it provided, it's entirely possible Chrysler would have continued declining until they became irrelevant or merged out of existence. The Hemi bought Chrysler time to develop other successful products, time to rebuild dealer networks, time to convince a generation of buyers that Chrysler knew how to build exciting cars. So what happened to the people behind this story? And what of Tom Hoover? The engineer who led the Hemi development program continued working at Chrysler for decades. He became known as the godfather of the Hemi, a title he apparently found amusing. In retirement, he was a fixture at automotive events, always happy to talk about the engine that defined his career. He passed away in 2016 at the age of 82. The tributes poured in from across the automotive world. Without Hoover's vision and technical expertise, the Hemi might never have existed. Richard Petty, the driver who introduced the Hemi to the world at that 1964 Daytona 500, went on to become the most successful driver in NASCAR history. 7 championships, 200 wins. He became known simply as the King. And he never forgot what the Hemi meant to his career. In interviews decades later, he still talked about the power, the reliability, the sheer dominance of those early Hemi engines. Chrysler itself survived, though not without struggles. The company would face multiple crises in subsequent decades, including a near bankruptcy in 1979 and another in 2009. But they kept building cars. They even brought back the Hemi name in 2003, applying it to a new generation of V8 engines. The modern Hemi isn't quite the same as the 426. It uses different technology and targets different goals, but the name still carries weight. People still know what Hemi means. The original 426 Hemi cars have become some of the most valuable collectible automobiles in existence. A 1971 Plymouth Cuda convertible with a Hemi engine sold at auction in 2014 for $3.5 million. Original documented Hemi Chargers and Roadrunners regularly sell for 6 figures. The scarcity that seemed like a weakness in 1971 became the ultimate strength for collectors, and the legend continues to grow. The Hemi is consistently ranked among the greatest American engines ever built. Car magazines still write about it, YouTube channels are dedicated to it, enthusiasts spend fortunes restoring Hemi cars to concours condition, not bad for an engine that almost never existed, an engine that was only built because a company was desperate enough to take a chance, an engine that proved, definitively, that sometimes the best way to save yourself is to build something extraordinary and let the world take notice. And that is the story of the 426 Hemi, an engine born from desperation, built with brilliance, and ultimately responsible for saving one of America's iconic automakers from extinction. Subscribe if you want more, and let me know in the comments. Had you heard of the Hemi before this? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.